Okay, Jonathan, you think you can start? Okay.
I think so.
Great. Hello, everyone. Good evening from Athens. And welcome to the Institute of Philosophy and Technology and the IPT Talk Series. This year, perhaps as you know, the theme of our series focuses on forms of intelligence and cognition. Previous IPT talks discussed the philosophical challenges of artificial intelligence or intelligences, in plural if you present, in some notable presentations delivered by Professor Noam Chomsky, Rafael Capurro, and the question of intelligent architecture by ennoiai Dio. Today's talk by Jonathan Young from the University of Oxford is devoted on a fascinating topic, in my view, non-human animal minds and cognition in Roman imperial debates regarding animals' religious behavior and thought. Jonathan Young's research centers on the intersections of the religious, philosophical, and intellectual history of the Roman Empire. His expertise includes early Christianity, ancient philosophy, especially the Platonic tradition, and we are so happy to have this common background, and the imperial prose and the reception of the earlier texts in the empire. Jonathan, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
And also thank you so much for extending one to me as well. Thank you all for attending. One quick note that I have is that I am going to be reading some translations throughout the text, and I am drawing upon for Origen's against Celsus, the translation from Henry Chadwick, and then for Aelian's on the history of animals, I am using E.F. Schofield's Loeb edition. And on both of these, I'm modifying. I'll let you know if I have modified those. So the Roman pagan, Claudius Aelian, 161 or 177 to 100 or to 230 to 38 CE, and the Alexandrian Christian Origen, about 184 to 85 to 253 CE, although from different religious traditions, shed light on divergent approaches to a similar philosophical problem regarding non-human animals having ennoiai, or conceptions of the divine. Multiple imperial writers discuss animal religious behavior positively. For instance, we find this in Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Philostratus. Moreover, some specifically indicate animals can have ennoiai of God. These are Celsus, Dio Chrysostom, and others deny that animals have these ennoiai, these conceptions of God, like Cicero, Philo, Plutarch, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and then those later, such as Lactantius and Chalcidius. One of the most extensive Christian argumentations regarding this comes from Origen's work, Contra Celsum, against Celsus, in opposition to the Middle Platonist named Celsus. Origen extensively argues against Celsus's claims that animals have conceptions of God or the divine. As Origen later insists, animals may appear to have pious thinking, but in reality they are non-rational and operate only according to nature, physis. In contrast, Aelian presents elephants as worshippers of the moon due to their conceptions of the goddess. Aelian, like Origen, also connects animals' conceptions of God to nature. This paper explores the relationship between nature and animals' conceptions of God, and it examines the possibilities of Origen and Aelian as both responding to Stoic discourse of pre-existing natural conceptions, otherwise known as physikai, ennoiai, or otherwise called common conceptions, koinai, ennoiai. These are shared by all people. Some scholars have even importantly argued that although Stoic in origin, some Imperial Platonists also use common or natural conceptions as part of their philosophies. These natural conceptions especially pertain to people's innate concepts of God. Generally, these natural conceptions extend only to humans in Stoic thought and not to animals. The Stoic Chrysippus, for instance, argues that humans have ennoiai conceptions, whereas animals only have phantasia, imagination. Both Origen and Aelian employ this terminology of natural or common conceptions in their work. The scholars Henry Chadwick and Marcel Bourret, in their commentaries to Origen's against Celsus, have briefly noted Origen's interplay with the Stoic common conceptions in describing humans. And Bourret has observed this in Origen and Celsus's discussion of these for animals. Nevertheless, scholarship has not elaborated on the larger significance of Origen's denial of these common conceptions to animals in opposition to what Celsus maintains. Origen will use the phrase without qualms when referring to human beings' conceptions of God, as we'll see. Scholars, however, as far as my reading, have not commented on Aelian's usage of common conceptions, or as Aelian phrases them, natural conceptions. Aelian, like the Platonist Celsus, extends these natural conceptions to non-human animals, granting them the concepts of survival strategies and virtuous gratitude. Underlying these dissimilar stances of Aelian and Origen regarding animals' conception of the divine is the question of animal cognition. Previous research has characterized this primarily in terms of a Stoic or Platonist debate about whether animals have logos, that is, reason. Scholars have situated Origen among the Stoic position that animals lack reason. Similarly, others have traced Aelian's indebtedness to Stoic thoughts on animals. This paper, though, reconsiders the utility of presenting the ancient discourse about animal cognition as a debate between only Stoics and Platonists. Since Origen and Aelian's relationship to wider philosophical thought is complex, this study doesn't try to identify whether their positions on animals align completely with Stoics or Platonists. Instead, this study suggests that these authors show engagement with the ideas of both schools in their discussions of animals and ennoiai of God. Furthermore, this paper adds to our understandings of the nuances in imperial discourse of animal cognition and its relationship to religious thought. Let's start with Origen and Aelian regarding animal conceptions of God. From his work against Celsus come Origen's most explicit comments against animal religious behavior in disagreement with Celsus's examples in favor. From his work, he bluntly refutes any claims that animals have concepts of God. Quote, we would have refuted the assertion that the non-rational animals are wiser than men, and exposed the falsity of the statement that they have notions, here ennoiai, of God more divine than ours, and that they have certain sacred associations with one another. Origen continues this line of rebuttal, saying, and it's not true that many of the animals would claim to have ideas, ennoia again, of God, for none of the irrational animals has any ennoia of him, any idea of him. And it is a lie that the non-rational animals are nearer in communication with God. Note that Origen here references conceptions in reference to an understanding of an innate understanding of God that would be held by animals. Throughout his corpus, Origen follows a similar line. We've seen all non-human animals as non-rational. Origen situates humans as part of a larger group of rational beings, including angels, demons, even stars, apart from the non-rational animals. According to Origen, this difference can be seen from Scripture. Humans, he explains, are in the image of God, as Genesis says, whereas animals are not, which implies a difference in their soul. Furthermore, humans' possession of logos is what is meant when we understand the meaning of image of God. More thorough explanation of his description comes from his characterization of animals as only working by non-rational behavior. He says, in his estimation, all animals, he uses ants and bees as an example, only act by impulse or imagination and never by reason. This is what he specifically says. Does he, that is Celsus, fail to comprehend that the rational mind is impelled by reasoning, while on the other hand, the non-rational mind is impelled by instinct, an unreasoning suggestion, and by a sort of natural constitution? In this divide between rational humans and non-rational animals, Origen specifically highlights this association between reason and religious participation. He further maintains that birds like storks and the mythical bird, the phoenix, they do not have more piety than people. He stresses their status as non-rational, and that this lack of reason means that they cannot engage in true religious behavior. According to him, storks may act favorably to their living parents, and the phoenix may provide a funeral for his father, but these actions, Origen says, happen non-rationally and naturally, as I translate it, and never by reason. Quote, after this, to prove as he thinks that storks are more pious than men, he uses the story, that is Celsus, he uses the story about the bird and that it returns affection and brings food to its parents. I may reply here too that storks do not do this as a result of thinking out what is morally right or by reasoning, but by nature, because their natural constitution is intended to set an example among non-rational animals that is able to put men to shame in the matter of paying their debt of gratitude to their parents. Had Celsus realized the extent of the difference between these things by reason and doing them without thinking, and naturally, he would not have said that storks are more pious than men. Slightly modified with a quotation. Origen further elaborates why animals may have pious actions despite their non-rationality, as he ultimately concludes God's providence allows for animals to provide examples of moral behavior for people. Quote, still striving to show the piety of non-rational animals, Celsus uses the Arabian bird, the phoenix, which after many years visits Egypt and brings its dead father buried in a ball of myrrh and puts him in the shrine of the sun. This is the story, but even if it's true, it is possible that it happens by nature. End quote. These statements imply that animals could be religious insofar as they act according to God's providence. The key difference is that animals act non-rationally, whereas humans can fully understand why and whom they worship. Let's turn now to Aelian. Aelian joins other ancient authors who depict various animals as having religious behavior. Elephants stand out as the most cited example of these behaviors. Among several instances of religiosity, Aelian describes elephants as showing honor to the morning sun. In another book, he specifically attributes this religious behavior shown by elephants to a conception of divinity. Here, specifically, the goddess of the moon, Selene. Additionally, Aelian explains that elephants worship the new moon. Quote, I am informed that when the new moon begins to appear, elephants by some natural and unexplained conception look upwards at the goddess. According to Aelian, elephants worship and direct their gaze to the goddess when she appears. As he explains, these actions towards the divinity are related to their cognition. I have translated this as some natural and unexplained conception, which is slightly different from what Schofield has translated as intelligence, but more aligns with the sense of Chadwick translating Origen with the word ennoiai, meaning a notion or a concept. Nonetheless, the characterization implies that these animals, because of their intelligence, are able to recognize the moon as a divinity. Let's now turn to Origen and Aelian's discussion of common or natural conceptions. And when we compare these, we see that Origen and Aelian have other instances of the word conception being used, but we find that they use these phrases in different ways. Origen will always use this phrase for humans, but Aelian applies this to non-human animals. Let's first observe Origen's discussion about common conceptions, koinai and ennoiai, pertaining to humans. The first example comes from Against Celsus 1.4, in which Origen argues that ethical thought is common for all people. His reason here is that all humans have access to a conception, a common conception that comes from God. Scholars such as Marcel Boré and Henry Chadwick have both observed the reminiscence of Origen's usage of this terminology with Stoic thought. Origen says, quote, let's see how Celsus thinks that he can criticize our ethical teaching on the grounds that it's commonplace. He later on says, I have to reply to this that For people who affirm the righteous judgment of God, it would have been impossible to believe in the penalty inflicted for sins unless, in accordance with the universal ideas, the koinai, ennoiai, all men had a sound conception of moral principles. I'd like to highlight that in this way, he uses a similar terminology that he does in refuting what Celsus says, but here it's only referring to people. And again, we find the phrase used twice, both in reference to people, to explain, as Origen argues, how people innately understand the nature of divinity in opposition to what particular customs may be. Chadwick also takes this passage as reminiscent of Stoic terminology. He says, consider whether the doctrines of our faith are not in complete accord with the universal notions when they change the opinions of people who give a fair hearing to what we say. Then he goes on to say, for even if the perverted idea supported by much instruction has been able to implant in the multitude the conception that images are gods and objects made of gold are worthy of worship, nevertheless, the universal conception, koinai ennoiai, demands that we do not think of God as corruptible matter at all, nor that he is honored when men make images of him in lifeless material objects, as though they were in his image or were symbols of him. And we see here, this is an innate understanding that he appeals to, common to all people. Our final example comes from Book 4 of Origins against Celsus, although it's an inconclusive parallel. Unlike the others that we have encountered, Origen uses the phrase physikai ennoiai, a natural conception, rather than a common conception. Here, he critiques the Stoic teachings of God as a material entity subject to change. Quote, furthermore, the God of the Stoics, in that he is corporeal, at one time when the conflagration occurs, consists entirely of mind. When the new world order comes, he becomes a part of it. Not even they have been able to perceive clearly the true natural conception of God. Chadwick doesn't take this passage as referring to a natural conception of God, but rather a conception of God's nature. I'm inclined, though, to agree with Bourret's observation that this passage does refer to a human's natural conception of God. In other words, Origen takes a phrase originating among the Stoics to criticize the Stoics themselves, saying that even they do not have a proper understanding of God. The people who say that they have made it clear that everyone has conceptions of God. It's against this background that we see a contrast of Origen's usage of the terms common or natural conceptions as only referring to people, as opposed to Celsus's contentions that animals too have these conceptions. Similar to Celsus, Aelian presents animals as having natural conceptions, physikai ennoiai. Not many, though, have commented on his particular usage of this terminology. In Book 8, Aelian continues to discuss these in reference to elephants' behavior. In this passage, Aelian describes how elephants avoid traps set by hunters. Quote, elephants would not easily fail to notice an ambush. For instance, when they come near to the pit which elephant hunters are in the habit of secretly digging, whether by some natural or divination-like, verily by Zeus, ineffable conception, it's a mouthful, they restrain themselves by going any further and turn back and put up the most strenuous resistance, as in war, and try to overthrow their hunters. Schofield takes ennoiai tini physikai, some natural instinct, as he translates it. And he simplifies the additional adjectives that Aelian uses. Schofield's interpretation is perhaps understandable, but this does not fully explain the complexity of Aelian's thought here and the underlying similarity it has with these other examples of animals. Aelian's phrasing suggests that he is not completely sure how to characterize this phenomenon. He first mentions it as a natural conception, but then continues with more additional adjectives to describe it, including then that not only is it a natural conception, but one that is like divination, but also ineffable or unable to be explained. Furthermore, his oath to Zeus and the overall description almost suggest divine inspiration of the god. And in this way, it seems that Aelian might be taking this passage as an explanation of why the elephants know how to stop and be avoiding capture by the hunters. In that same book, though, book 8, Aelian provides another story of another animal. In this case, it's about an animal's innate ability to know about their well-being, and arguably about their innate ability to be grateful. In this story, Aelian explains that there was a lady in the town of Tarentum who found an injured baby stork, a stork who had broken his leg. And in this case, she helps him to recuperate, but one day when the stork decides to leave, he flies away because, as Aelian says, he had an innate understanding that he was healed and well enough to go. Now, Schofield translates this passage, and the scope, quote, and the stork, knowing by some strange instinct that it owed her the price of its life, departed. But I wish to suggest another translation based on the Greek here. Quote, and the stork, knowing by some natural and wondrous conception that it owed her the price of its life, departed. If we look at it this way, this instance shares in the others that Aelian describes, showing that the animal has some idea of what he or she is doing, something that is innate to them and understood on some level. What is even more is that Aelian further explains that this bird was so grateful for the care that this lady showed him that he visited her again and brought her a little gift of a stone. He goes on to say about how animals like this stork can then, how they themselves are able to remember how to be grateful. This leads us to our conclusion. This present study has attempted to avoid placing Origen and Aelian in strict alignment with either Stoic or Platonist schools of thought about animals, especially whether they have common or natural conceptions. It's clear, though, that this concept was present in broader conversations outside the confines of these philosophical schools. We see that for both authors of Origen and Aelian, that the claim that animals have conceptions of the divine must be put in context, at least tacitly, in a broader argument of how similar animals are to humans in having this and other types of conceptions. The Christian Origen denies that these conceptions can be for animals, against the suggestions that Origen has in favor of them. Meanwhile, though, Origen will freely speak of humans as having common conceptions of ethical conduct and the nature of God. When we come to the Roman polytheist Aelian, however, he presents multiple examples of animals as being religious. Multiple examples of animals having natural conceptions, not just about the divine, but also regarding their own safety and well-being. Now, it's true that Aelian, in his writing, had focused on animals and not on humans alone. But taken together, both Aelian and Origen allow us to obtain a better understanding of how these ideas are being used by authors of this time. It also allows us to explore further examples of this phenomenon among other authors of antiquity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much
You're
for
welcome.
this extremely interesting and exciting topic. I would like to ask the audience if there are any questions that you would like, or any discussion that you would like to have. You can just raise your hand. I could start, for instance, and you can actually see what's going on. So my question actually is going again to refer to this very interesting passage from Iamblichus. This short treatise, but unfortunately lost on virtues. That Iamblichus mentions that there are some animals that they are capable of ethical behavior. I would like to ask you if you think that this, of course, for me, it's a very unique case, but as I can see that in Celsus and Aelian, we have notes, elements, or echoes of such a behavior. Do you think that this ethical behavior that the Iamblichus notes might include elements of a religious activity, that, or a kind of a conception which could be natural or something? I would like to know what you think about this Iamblichian reference to animal ethics.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is how are we defining the word religion here? A very amorphous term, non-existent, so to speak, in antiquity. Broadly construed, if we look at it as a set of actions and beliefs that people have of how does one do well-being to one another and to the gods, or in the Christian case, in the Jewish case, to only one God. I think that there could be a possibility of extending it to a type of idea that, like Origen says, of eusebia, of piety. It all comes down to what type of virtue that we have, and whether I think that it is directed towards others of the same species, other living beings, or whether that those virtues are also being shown in particular of how the being is in response to this divine entity. correct belief, correct kind of right action in a way, right reverence in those ways. So I'd say I'd be open to the thought. But it makes me wonder specifically whether he has something, not seeing the passage, I would wonder whether he has something more along the lines of behavioral aspects and less conceptual. But that, in some ways, behavior does require some idea of what you're doing, one might argue. In the case of what Aelian tries to examine of how can someone do something, how can an animal do something if it does not have some idea behind it, and that idea must have to come from this innate type of an idea.
Yes, and I think that's very interesting, the use of the term ennoiai, which either if it is natural or it is a common thing, actually seems to bring close, I think for the very first time, I'm not sure about the literature on animal minds and ethics in the classical age, or there are some elements in early Greek philosophy, but I think during this Hellenistic and the Roman Empire, the late antiquity, we have some interesting references. And you mentioned elephants, and you mentioned the example of the stork. I think that were really interesting and highlights this interest of the philosophers to try to see other forms of intelligence, as far as I can understand, in different non-human animals, as we could say today. And you mentioned, I think, a very important keyword, virtues. And do you think that there might be some element of some dispositions in some animal virtues in terms of being trained or being, in a way, very close to human communities or human culture? Elephants, we know that they have these storks, of course, not in this way. But if there are some animals that being closer to humans and the human societies might also inspire philosophers to consider their intelligence and cognition.
Absolutely. So the way that we see the evidence, in some ways, it's not surprising to what someone from a 21st century approach might expect. There tends to be focuses on mammals and birds. 2 instances of insects, but social insects like bees and ants are given an example. There are other disparate examples of insects, not specifically given any particular cognition, but at least are said, whether tongue-in-cheek or in a fantastic fictional way, to be a part of the afterlife and things like that. So they're able to fit them within this larger world without having to have rationality or cognition as being the main thing. The question then, for often for authors of the period, as I said, for elephants, their behavior is seen as surpassing what humans often do. Pliny the Elder actually makes it really clear that their religio, their religious behavior, religio is a hard word to exactly describe, but it goes beyond what even humans in the present day of his time would do. And then there are other animals that are seen very, very positively. In Oppian, we see multiple examples of dolphins. Pliny writes about apes. Not much is given, though. It's really sad that he doesn't describe how much, but he talks about how their emotion is very similar to human in the way that they react in what he describes as worship of the changing of the moon. And then we have discussions, many examples of questions about dogs. They are very important as an example of a very intelligent animal that deserves explanation in the ancient literature. And of birds, in particular parrots, they have a question: if a parrot can produce speech, then there's a question then that if the parrot has a sound that is uttered, that must mean that there's some internal sound like a human has that is going on behind the scene. Or maybe they don't. But at least it prompts the question of, if it has the sound, does it mean that there's something behind it? And I spoke with a friend of mine yesterday about GPT. We asked it some questions and things like trying to stump it. We couldn't quite. This new artificial intelligence chat interface. And I was telling my friend, I said, well, this is very similar to how this ancient conundrum of if it can produce something in voice, here it was written, but very similar if in a language, does it mean that there's an internal language? Do we go so far to say that there's something behind the utterance? We weren't ready to say that with the ChatGPT, but the question remains with, in antiquity, it was very much a hot topic to ask oneself, what do we do with the similarity that we see?
Yes, and this is really enlightening because actually, of course, it's something that there are more experts than me on this, but we know that now this distinction between language and speech comes from the 19th century and the 20th century, which is more developed, and language, linguistics, and modern linguistics particularly is something extremely interesting to be noted as a question in antiquity, and that's really very, very important. And another issue which is really interesting, and I could relate it in the history of ancient Greek thought, is this use of koinai and this commonality. That philosophers, not only Platonists, try to see some common elements not only in human minds, but also with other minds. And this search for these common elements might be very interesting because of the the context, the social, the political, the religious, and all the other elements where the koina, the commonality, might be an issue that we search for between different cultures. And I don't know what you think about that, not only in terms of this search for common elements, if it is a sign of a different philosophical approach to things.
Well, it's I'm not entirely certain on what the full answer to that would be, but what I would say is that within the ancient literature, there is a clear attempt to understand why humans, of all the other animals, if people consider them animals, and sometimes they did, would be so different. And so there's a search of trying to identify, well, if we're not common with the other animals, perhaps we have more in common with the gods or with God. But that then asks, what specifically do we have in common? And for some authors, there's some form of thinking that is similar. Whereas if they want to show the commonality with animals, there does tend to be a cultural disposition to highlight that as somehow negative, things to avoid those commonalities. Whereas there's a smaller minority among, not necessarily the minority, but a smaller that we see in antiquity of a search to go against this extreme difference and to highlight the similarities, even if they do not immediately say that that it's absolutely the same. But I don't think often that they are saying that it's absolutely the same, but showing that there's a gradual or a variety, as you're saying, of intelligent beings, some more than others. Humans maybe have more, if we put it in that way, and then try to explain, well, why does that come about?
Yes, and
various explanations.
Yes, and as you note, this it is interesting how the divine or the concept of the divine seems to unify something. So this unity or between beings that have an aspiration, or they might be this, or might be in the Platonist the source of the different species and intelligences, also has this network of beings that they are unified through this specific manifestation of intelligence. And so this is the source of unity and the aim of unity, considering the Platonic goodness or the Neoplatonic one, and all this this very important principle of unity that seems to be also underlined in this case. Yes, and this is a very important observation and implication of what you discussed today. If there are any other questions, because it is a very interesting dialogue with Jonathan, and we could discuss for hours about this extremely interesting topic. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm not sure if there are any other questions, and we are so happy to have you and discuss such a very interesting topic, which is not only important for late antiquity and the history of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, but seems to be a trend during our own times with animal minds, and perhaps reconsidering some issues, as you said, with modern artificial intelligence software and programs like the one that you mentioned, the ChatGPT, and what is really intelligence and how it is related to language, by considering how language is expressed by different beings, including humans and non-human elements, but perhaps not only being extended to funds and other things. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was a great honor to have you. And thank all the participants for joining us. And just to know that the talk is going to be in our YouTube channel to find out. And if since you haven't been here from the very first moment, thank you very much. Have a great night from Athens, and hope to see you another event. Thank you very much.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a great talk. Yes, indeed. Yes. Bye, Jonathan. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for your participation.